Welcome to this tutorial in which you will learn how to interpret the demographic transition model. It's a model which helps you to identify the birth rate, the death rate and the total population over time from stage 1 through to stage 5. Let's begin by looking at the death rate. The death rate is plotted on a graph. On the y-axis you have the rate per 1,000, so I'm going to start this one at 0, going up to a maximum of 25 deaths per 1,000 people in a population. On the x-axis you have the stages through time from stage 1 through to stage 5. The death rate begins very high, and then over time, as a country develops, the death rate will fall, and in stage 5 it actually starts to rise again for reasons which I will reveal. So let's take a look at why the death rate follows this pattern. So stage 1 here represents a very high death rate. This is a country which is very poor and less developed. It has a high death rate, let's say 25 deaths per 1,000 of the population, due to disease, war and famine. This is a country lacking in resources, perhaps it's facing natural hazards, perhaps it's in a tropical climate where tropical diseases like malaria is more common. As a country begins to develop, the death rate will begin to fall, partly due to improved medical care, so vaccinations against diseases like measles can be prevented. There may be a more stable government, so less war, and there would be more secure food and water supplies. So the death rate would be low, let's say about 10 deaths per 1,000 people. As a country develops through to stage 4 to 5, there is an increasing number of elderly people in the population, and the elderly population will naturally die once they get old, and that is why in very well-developed countries, UK, Germany, USA, the death rate is on the increase. So now let's take a look at the birth rate. The birth rate is on a similar graph with the rate per 1,000 live births of the population on the y-axis, and on the x the stages through time. The birth rate begins also very high through stage 1 and 2, and then it begins to decrease over time, continuing further and further to decrease. Let's take a look at the reasons why it follows this pattern. So the birth rate is high, maybe 25 per 1,000 of the population, because in a primitive society, in stage 1, the children are needed for farm labour. There is mainly subsistence farming, and it is important to have the workforce. Also, there is a lack of contraception in the society, and also women tend to have a role where they stay at home and have children and bring up children, looking after them, rather than going out to work. Their fertility window is also much bigger. That means they may start having babies from puberty all the way through to their 40s. So they are more likely to have more children, hence a high birth rate. As a country develops, the birth rate will begin to fall, maybe to 12 live births per 1,000. And this can be attributed to things like girls' education being improved. If you start to educate girls, they will then go on to perhaps have a career, and they will delay having a family. Some will choose not to have a family at all, and they will remain childless. This all contributes towards a low birth rate. Similarly, contraception may be more available in a society, perhaps because the healthcare system is able to provide it for free or able to distribute it more widely. In some countries, the birth rate is so low, at stage 5 over here, that it's actually below the death rate, so the population is actually shrinking. So let's take a look at the death rate, birth rate on the same graph and see how the population changes. So the population and how fast it's rising or falling is indicated by this brown line here. Let's take a look at why it follows this pattern. Let's start at the beginning in stage 1, where you have a very high birth rate and a very high death rate. The death rates and the birth rates are very similar. As a result, the population is going to be very stable. It's not going to grow. And that is why the line is relatively flat. A country at this stage would be known as a low-income country. Stable population, but with high birth and death rates. Now let's take a look at where the population starts to increase along here. The population is rising quite quickly, and this is due to the difference between the birth rate here and the death rate here. You can see that there are many more births than deaths, and this difference between the two lines shows you that the population is growing. There is a natural rate of increase. And we've already discussed that the reason why the death rate is falling is because the country is becoming more developed, able to afford a better healthcare system. This kind of country at this stage would be a newly emerging economy, a country like India. As a country develops even further through time, the population, once it's increased, begins to stabilise. And this is primarily because the birth rates and the death rates are now fairly similar. Very small difference between births and deaths will lead to a more stable population. And a country at this state of development is a very well developed society, and we call these higher income countries. And finally, you'll notice that the population in stage 5 begins to decrease. And if you look carefully, you'll notice that the death rate is higher than the birth rate. So more people are dying in a society than are being born. And the difference between the two here shows us that there is a natural rate of decrease. So hopefully you've learned that the demographic transition model can give us much information: birth rates, death rates, the total population and rate of increase or decrease, and also it's very useful for showing how a country develops over time from a primitive society, lower income country, a newly emerging economy, and a higher income country.